Q&A feature to drop in any questions, comments that you might have, and we will be monitoring those throughout the afternoon. So a quick review of session one. In session one, we talked about really 4 different areas here. We talked about perceptions of disability. And when we unpacked that, we really started to think about how disability is the largest minority in the world, how it crosses all genders, ethnicities, socioeconomic backgrounds. We unpacked the difference between visible and invisible disabilities. We also talked a little bit about IDEA and ADA and really the laws around disability accessibility, and that this work is not just kind of that feel-good work, but there's actually legal responsibilities that schools have to ensure accessibility, equitability, and inclusivity of their students with disabilities. A topic that seemed to really resonate with folks last time was this idea of language around disability. We talked about person-first language. We talked about the power that language has to cultivate inclusive and exclusive communities. And that language isn't just oral language, but it's also written language as well. And then lastly, we explored the ideas of neurodiversity as well as ableism and ableistic perspectives. During the last session, there were tons and tons of questions. We didn't get a chance to answer all of them, but we are going to answer a couple of them right now. So Janelle had kind of curated a few questions from the Q&A box last time, and we're going to answer a couple of those right now.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, I pulled out 2 that actually represent a theme that I saw throughout most of the questions. So the first one is, how can we support parents with their children as they go into the process of transitioning into adulthood?
Great. Thanks, Janelle. That's such an important question. And tonight, we're going to talk a lot about parents as a really valuable stakeholder in this work. So as parents, I think that it's really important that we support parents in providing them strategies, tools, and resources to talk to their kids with disabilities about their disability. That I think sometimes parents, being kind of, you know, the mother bears, if you will, just do everything for their child, or they don't necessarily talk to their kid. They don't want their kid to feel different or ostracized or on the outside. But it's actually really important that we do empower and educate our students about themselves. And that from that can help them learn those self-advocacy skills that they need later in life as in adulthood. So I think it's really about this kind of parallel skill building of self-advocacy and self-confidence. And the way that I always talk about it is that in order to be a self-advocate, you need to have self-confidence. And in order to have self-confidence, you need to understand yourself. So I think parents can really help in that way. And this is also a plug that series 3 of this programming that we're offering is actually going to be geared towards parents. So we'll make sure that a link to that goes in the chat. We would really encourage you to share that as an opportunity with parents that you work with.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. We just dropped a link in the chat, and it would be a wonderful opportunity for families and caretakers and parents to join us and have more of these discussions. So another question was, a lot of school programs are designed in a uniform way for all kids with disabilities to be able to do similar tasks. How do
Just sent a message to Janelle. Janelle, are you hearing us? Your audio went out.
Oh, thank you. I wasn't sure whose end it was on. So I think Janelle's question was that oftentimes schools kind of just put all students with disabilities together. and just expect them to do things in a uniform way. And the way that I would respond to that is part of what we need to do is change the mindset of school leaders and educators that students with disabilities aren't just one bucket. That within students with disabilities, there is such variation, there's such a spectrum, there's such a range of not just like the diagnoses, but the personality types, the likes and dislikes, the learning styles. And so I think it really is about helping to change the mindset of, I would just say, probably school leaders, policymakers, that students with disabilities are not just lumped together in one category, that students with disabilities all have their own individualistic personalities and traits. And that's, we're going to talk a little bit more about this afternoon as well. So the other thing that I want to just recognize and acknowledge is in the last session, we asked you to fill out some Google Forms with some reflection questions. And I want to acknowledge and graciously thank all of you who did that, because in looking through the responses, I was really, really blown away by the honesty, by your vulnerability, in what you chose to write. And that we also recognize there was tons and tons of more questions in there. So we're going to be working on sharing with you down the road some more kind of answers to your questions, because there was great questions. We want to make sure we support all of you. So now that we've reviewed a little bit about what we did in session 1, it's time to really dive in to session 2 here. How can we take those perceptions? How can we take that common language? How can we take our understanding of laws around disability and our understanding around neurodiversity and ableism and really start to take that new mindset, those new perceptual shifts, put it into action? So we've got an idea, we got a plan, and now we've got to act upon it. So as you know from last session, I really like throwing in little quotes throughout the presentation. So I want to start with one from Catherine Pulsiver, and it says, "We are all different, which is great because we are all unique. Without diversity, life would be very boring." So action only makes change if it's done with intentionality. And so you could go back to your school and you could take all these new ideas around disability and perception and just start talking about it, or sharing this recording with your school leader. And that's great. That's a great first start. But what I really want to do is think about what are some kind of high level 30, 40, 50,000 foot strategies that you can be thinking about and considering to ensure that the action that you take is really done with intentionality. The first model that I want to share with you is something that I call the ladder of risk. Recognizing that these conversations that we're having are risky. They ignite vulnerabilities. As we talked about last time, everybody knows somebody who has a disability. This is personal. And even looking at some of your Google form responses last time, there were some very, very vulnerable responses. And some people are just like, I just don't know where to begin. So when you think about a ladder, like the ladder that's on the screen, you've got low risk at the bottom and high risk at the top. And one of the things that I like folks to do is when you think about pushing out or advocating for or implementing more of this type of work in your school and district, we really want to be intentional with how we roll it out by starting with low risk and working up the steps of the ladder to higher risk. And in the green box to the right, I noted that you really want to consider the risk for all members of the learning community. So for example, the risk level that you might start at for special educators who might be more familiar with students with disabilities might be very different than the risk level you're going to start at with gen ed teachers, which might be a different level that you're going to start at when you're working with parents who have students with disabilities. So you really want to be mindful and intentional. Okay, well, where are we starting based on the stakeholders that we're working with and their own, not just familiarity with students with disabilities, but their comfort around students with working with or advocating around students with disabilities. So for example, low risk would be, in my mind, starting with laws around disability, right? No one's going to dispute that. That's legal jurisdiction, right? So if you wanted to start doing this work at your school, you might start with the laws around disability, LRE, ADA, IDEA. That'd be pretty low risk, right? Then the next level might be perceptions about disability. A little bit higher risk, we're pushing people a little bit. Next level might be language around disability. Next level might be ableism, right? So do you see what we're doing here? We're being like really, really intentional. If we're working with parents, the first low risk might be tell us about your kids, right? Parents love talking about the kids, just talking about their kids and who they are, right? And then the next level might be pushing parents to think about, well, have you talked to your kid about their disability? And the next level after that might be, have you talked to your kid about how they advocate for their disability? So you see what we're doing? We're really being mindful in how we roll this out. And so really, and when I'm, and at this point during the school year, now that it's, almost mid and January, I would almost be thinking about how you can take this model and think about how it fits into the timeline of next school year, 22-23. So really thinking about, okay, I know I'm going to do 6 parent sessions with my parent group of kids with disabilities over the course of the year, and really kind of thinking about those 6 parent groups on this letter of risk. Or I know I can get my administrator to commit 3 PD days over the course of the year to talk about these issues. All right, let me think about where they're going to be in the school year and think about where they fall in the ladder of risk. So I hope this model is helpful. I think when people look at this slide at first, they go, well, this is really obvious. It's a ladder. It's kind of simple, but it actually isn't. And so really thinking about it in this way, I think can ensure that the way in which you deliver content can be done in a really scaffolded way. Another high-level model that I want to share with you is this model of a house. And you can tell I like visuals, right? Because I think, you can always be thinking about a picture of a ladder in your brain when you're talking to someone and planning this stuff out. Same with this house. So when you build a house, you build the foundation first, and that's what supports everything else. So much of this work, so much of changing that mindset in order to change behavior is about awareness of these topics. And so in order to enact, in order to develop a sense of empathy, understanding of other people, which then makes changes to make the world a more inclusive place, we need to ensure that we provide everybody the opportunity to have a solid, deep foundation of awareness of differences and disabilities. So if we can provide, again, think about all of our stakeholders, our parents, our fellow colleagues, and our students, if we can provide them with a deep and solid foundation of awareness of disabilities and differences, as people work up the stories of the house, or I like to think about as chapters of their lives or have various experiences, they'll have that knowledge, that awareness to fall back on so they can demonstrate more empathetic behavior, right? I can't expect you to think about how to be inclusive to me if you have zero awareness of me and my lived experience, what's hard for me, what's easy for me, how I perceive the world. So it's so important that we build that awareness of foundation first. So again, another model, high level. Last high level model here. And I know I'm kind of beating a dead horse. I've said this like a million times, but I'm going to say it 1,000,001 to make sure we all understand. In order to change action behavior, whether that's your administrator in policy, whether that's parents and how they support their kids, whether that's kids and what they think about themselves or how they treat others, whether that's para-educators, whether that's fellow colleagues, whatever it is, in order to change behavior, we need to change mindsets. We need to change attitudes. We need to change perceptions. We need to change stereotypes and biases. And in order to change the mindset, we need to ensure that, going back to that house model, we have that solid foundation of the awareness and the knowledge about what we're talking about. So yes, last session, we really focused on building that awareness, right? We talked about what are disabilities, language, ableism. Was really about building that awareness of differences. Today, hopefully I can give you some concrete strategies to be thinking about how you can move from this blue square to the green square. Just want to check the chat here and make sure I'm not missing anything. Janelle, is there anything in the chat that I need to stop and pause?
No, Sam, I think we're good so far. I'm not seeing any questions come in.
Okay. Well, just a reminder, if you have questions or comments, throw them in the chat or the Q&A box.
Yeah, there was one and Dawn did a great job addressing it. So we got it.
Thank you, Dawn. I have such a great team on the back end. I appreciate it. Get everybody the information they need so they can make their schools better places for students with disabilities. So in thinking about that house model, that awareness is the foundation. We did that last time. Empathy is the roof. Let's talk a little bit about what empathy is and make sure that everybody understands what empathy is. I think oftentimes in schools, we use the age-old saying of putting yourself in someone else's shoes. And I think that's kind of half what empathy is. Like, we're 50% of the way there. The challenge I have with that when we say that to students is oftentimes we say that to students when we haven't built an awareness, foundation of awareness, right? We can't ask Sally to put herself in Johnny's shoes if she knows nothing about Johnny and how Johnny experiences the world. So we're kind of asking her to do something that she can't do. So what I want to do is unpack empathy a little bit further here and really help us recognize that empathy isn't just putting yourself in someone else's shoes. Empathy is feeling with somebody else. It's about tapping into yourself, thinking about a past experience you had that made you feel the same way someone else is feeling. And in that way, you can respond in an empathetic way. So to kick us off, one of my favorite people, Brene Brown, I want to share with you a short video clip on the difference between empathy and sympathy, in which Brene Brown really unpacks how empathy drives connection and sympathy drives disconnection. And especially when we think about students with disabilities, we want to be approaching them from an empathetic perspective to drive and build a relationship and a connection, not approaching students with disabilities from a sympathetic perspective, which drives disconnection.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, "I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me." Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So again, in your Padlet, you have access to this slide deck if you want to rewatch this video or share it with others. But I think it's such a great video of really breaking down that difference between empathy and sympathy. And every time I see it, I wonder to myself, why hasn't Hallmark started empathy cards, right? You go to, Walgreens or whatever, there's all these sympathy cards, but we're saying sympathy drives disconnection. Why don't we write empathy cards? That could actually be a great activity in school for kids, to write empathy cards to one another. So when we think about empathy, just to kind of review what Brene mentioned in the video, is that they really talk about empathy being broken up into 4 different components. That empathy is the ability to take the perspective of another person in a given situation. And when we take their perspectives, we stay out of judgment. So I like to think about that as almost like I'm kind of looking at the situation from a bird's eye view. I'm removing myself and my personal connection to the situation. I'm looking for ways to recognize a connection with another person, and then we communicate. And I think of communication as the way that we show, both with our body language, the words that we use, how we're talking, right? And what we're saying. We show somebody in that situation, hey, I'm trying to make a connection with you. I'm staying out of judgment, and I'm working really hard to take your perspective in this given situation. And so this is why I started out by saying, telling kids, put yourself in someone else's shoes, is a pretty diluted version of empathy. And that I would argue, as educators, we actually aren't really qualified to teach kids about empathy unless we first self-reflect on our own ability to meet these requirements, to be truly empathetic individuals, both in and outside of our professional lives. And so with that, I would encourage you to think about some reflective questions. And we're not going to write them down or anything. Feel free to drop some answers into the chat or anything you're thinking about right now as I go through this. But these are really questions that I would encourage you to think about, tomorrow morning when you're out on a walk or a run before work, or if you're driving to work, or just having your coffee if you're working in front of Zoom. But questions that you can really use to reflect and think a little deeper about this idea of empathy. And these could also be great questions that you could share with your colleagues at a staff meeting. Maybe have them watch that video that I just shared with you and ask them to think about these questions. So thinking about yourself and those 4 components of empathy, what of those components are your strengths? And at the same time, what of those components are hard for you? And I'll tell you, when I do this, not on Zoom, in an open room, I often ask educators to raise their hand, and we do a little live poll of which of the components are hardest and easiest. And 9 out of 10 workshops I do, educators say staying out of judgment is the hardest. And I think that's really interesting, and it's important to be reflective and vulnerable to think about, okay, what parts of empathy do I have and I feel confident with, and what parts do I need to work on? Another question to really consider is, how can an understanding of empathy drive greater understanding of students with disabilities, especially this idea of sympathy versus empathy? And how can school staff support each other in developing the necessary skills around empathy, right? You might have some individuals in your school that are really great at perspective taking, but struggle with communication, or are really good with staying out of judgment, but struggle with making connections. And so how collectively as a school staff can you work collaboratively, build off of each other's strengths to ensure that all students feel like they're being treated in a very authentically empathetic way? So one of my favorite books that I had to read in 8th grade, To Kill a Mockingbird, main character Atticus Finch says, if you can learn a simple trick, Scout, you'll get along a lot better with all kinds of folks. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb inside of his skin and walk around in it. So Atticus Finch, 1962, in To Kill a Mockingbird, teaching his daughter Scout about the importance of empathy, something we should always be teaching all students every day. So we've been talking a lot about kind of students with disabilities and this idea of inclusion and equity and accessibility and empathy. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that when we talk about students with disabilities, we need to be very careful that we recognize that a student with a disability also has other components that make up their identity, right? In the last session, I used the visual of an identity puzzle to help us thinking about our identity is made up of different puzzle pieces, and that a student with a disability just has one piece that's their disability, but they have all these other pieces. And so what I would really encourage you to think about is how, when we consider changing mindsets of people around students with disabilities, how we ensure that we're helping folks think about this from a very kind of macro, broad range. That yes, we're supporting students with disabilities, but we don't want to be devoid of the other puzzle pieces that make up those students. Next, I want to share with you a TED Talk by a young man who's 11 years old. The TED Talk is called We Are All Different, and that's awesome. And in this TED Talk, Cole, the young man, shares a little bit about a special friendship that's pretty unique. And as you watch this TED Talk, I would ask that in the chat, you drop in why you think I chose this TED Talk to really kind of jump as a jumping off point for this continued work that we're doing around supporting this mindset shift into actionable change around people with disabilities.
My name is Cole, and over the next few minutes, I'm going to teach you that it's okay to be different. Since a young age, I've worn different colored socks and 2 different shoes. Why? Because I am unique, a standout from the crowd. I feel best when I am being me. This summer, a funny thing happened. I was in a bookstore with my mom when I realized everyone was strangely quiet. And so I did what needed to be done. I started singing. As a joke, my mom pointed to a book and said, "Hey Cole, this book is for you." I pulled it out and read the cover. Here's what it said: "You're weird." A creative journal for misfits, oddballs, and anyone else who's uniquely awesome. It's the best book ever. It tells everyone it's cool to be different. Today, I'm going to tell you about a friendship of mine that is a little different than you might expect. This is one of my best friends, Steven. He is the happiest person I know. Steven is 44 years old and has autism. Let me start by explaining how we became special friends. When my mom was just 13 years old, she was in the high school cafeteria about to have lunch with her friends. Then she passed a table of kids with special needs. Steven was a boy at that table. He shouted out, "Hey, what's your name? Come sit with me." My mom sat down, and in that moment, a special friendship began. Stephen asked my mom 3 questions. He wanted to know what she was having for lunch, her phone number, and if they could be friends for 40 years. As my mom gave him her phone number and said yes, he clapped with excitement and said, "I will call you every day." Ever since that day, in 1988, he has kept his promise and called our house every single day. When I was born, Stephen was a special part of our family, and I've grown up calling him Uncle Stephen. Stephen is included in family dinners, he comes to my soccer games, he loves watching movies with us, and every couple of weeks he has a sleepover. Stephen has had autism his whole life. Autism spectrum disorder refers to a range of conditions characterized by challenges with social skills, repetitive behaviors, speech and nonverbal communications, as well as by unique strengths and differences. My friend Stephen is not able to drive a car, but he is able to memorize every phone number he has ever heard. There is no cure for autism, but I think Stephen is perfect the way he is. One of my favorite memories with Stephen is whenever a fire truck passes us. He shouts out when I grow up, "I want to be a fire truck." That always makes me smile. He likes the idea of being a fireman, but he loves the idea of being a fire truck. Another thing that always makes me laugh is how much he likes to eat. Have you ever met someone who can eat a steak, 8 slices of pizza, French fries, apple pie, ice cream, and they are still starving? Well, Stephen eats all that almost every time we see him. Finally, one of my favorite memories with Stephen is when we play hide and seek. He always hides in the closets. I love playing hide and seek with Stephen. It always makes me smile. But not just me. He makes everyone smile. I don't think we need a cure for autism, just like we don't need a cure for freckles. Autism is not a disease, just like brown hair isn't a disease. You don't need to fix something that isn't broken. I look up to my Uncle Stephen as he is the happiest person I know. Stephen doesn't try to be like anyone else. He is exactly who he was meant to be. Imagine a world where we all live like Stephen. Find out what makes you different. Don't be afraid to stand out. Wake up, jump out of bed, and be exactly who you are. We are all a little different, and that's awesome. Thank you.
So I love starting conversations around disability and inclusion and differences and identity with that TED Talk. And every time I watch it, I actually think of it, sparks a new thought for me. What I like about it is he talks about this special relationship and emphasizes that even though his friend Stephen has autism, there's all these other qualities that make up Stephen. And so when we think about classroom diversity, when we think about students with disabilities, we always want to be mindful of like, what are those intersectionalities between a student with a disability and other components that make up their identity. So as I go around on the screen, be thinking about kind of your own student body, the population that you support, and how when we think about students with disabilities, what other kind of these bubbles are a part of who they are? What other of these bubbles plays a role in perhaps the way you're going to show empathy for that student, the way you're going to include that student, the way you're going to work with that student or work with those families? So in thinking about this a little bit more, we're going to do a little activity that I like to call Think of One Student. So as I've mentioned before, disability is just one layer of a student's identity or just one piece of the puzzle. And this is an activity that I think, and this kind of goes back to the question Janelle asked me at the very beginning of this afternoon's webinar, which was a question from session 1, which is about how can we change the mindset of educators to not lump kids with disabilities all into the same category. And so this is an activity that I like to call Think of One Student. And in a moment, there's going to be a link to a Google Doc that will go in the chat. But if you look on the screen right now, what you'll see is kind of this multiple layers here. And in the middle, we have the student's disability, whatever that might be. And then each layer building out from that are other pieces of that student's identity, other pieces of that student's identity puzzle, things that we need to consider when we create inclusive environments for these students, when we act in empathetic ways towards them, but really being mindful that a student with a disability is way more than simply a student with a disability. So in the chat is a Google Doc, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull that up on my screen, and I'm going to show you what we'd like you to do. So give me 1 second here to make sure that I pull up the right document. So if you click the link in the chat, it's going to bring you to a Think of One Student Google Doc template. Do not write on this because everyone will see it. But what you can do is you can go, and there's directions right here. You can say File, make a copy. You can name it whatever you want and save it to your own drive. And then up will come your own version of this. And what we're going to do is give you about 2.5 minutes. We're going to play some quiet music in the background to give folks time to think. What I'd like you to do is think of one student that you've worked with currently or you've worked with in the past. And I'd like you to fill this out. And you're not going to share it with us. It's completely just for you. But start with the student, start with their disability, and then move out, and you can add boxes as you see fit, and really think about what are those other elements? What are those other pieces to their identity puzzle? What are those there's layers to their identity that you think are really important to consider when we think about better understanding this student? And while I say this is a good exercise, I would encourage you to bring this exercise back to your school and have different teachers do it, especially teachers that maybe have more of a narrow mindset on their perceptions of disability. If you have questions about this or trouble with the technology, put it in the chat and we'll make sure we address it. But again, I'll give you about 2.5 minutes. We'll play some quiet music. Think of one student and all the layers or identity puzzles that make up that student as a unique individual, regardless of disability. So we'll come back together. Sahima, I think that's how you pronounce your name. I love that you put that in the chat. That's terrific. And so many of these videos can be impactful, not just for adults like us, but for kids as well. All right. So thank you everybody for taking some time. I hope that was a valuable exercise and really just kind of pausing and stopping and thinking about this. And I know we do this every day. We think about students beyond their disability, but in the busyness of the day, we oftentimes don't actually have the time and the space to really sit down and write it down and really kind of be very intentional and reflective in that. So in thinking about this activity, I'd like you to reflect a little bit on how it impacted you. So in the chat in a moment, we're going to throw a Google form in like we did last time. Again, the Google forms are entirely anonymous, but there's just going to be 2 questions on this. So I'm only going to give you like a minute and a half this time. But really the 2 questions are, how has this exercise, the think of one student exercise, perhaps changed your perspective on students with disabilities, either if you want to think about it as the one student you chose to write about or just kind of generally? And are there any biases or stereotypes you have realized you have or have had about specific students with disabilities? Again, sometimes our biases or stereotypes are kind of subconscious or unconscious. We don't even think about them, but they do come out in maybe the language we use or what we think a student is capable of, or what we think a student likes or doesn't like. So I'm just kind of wondering as you reflect to think about going through this process of think of one student, is there anything that really jumped out at you? So I'm going to have Janelle just play the music. There's only 2 questions for about 90 seconds. And in the chat, you can click on that link to fill out that form. So please take a moment to do that, and then we'll come back together and keep moving along. All right, thanks everybody for taking the time to do that. I hope it's helpful to have these little moments of reflection. Diversity is a fact. Inclusion is an act. I really like this quote. It's so simple, right? Talking 6 words or 8 words, sorry, but it's very powerful. All right, so how do we move forward? How do we help inspire actionable change? How do we ensure that we're pushing a change in perception, a change in mindset when it comes to students with disabilities, understanding them, creating more inclusive environments? So what I want to do now is give you some very tangible strategies that you can take back to your schools and districts. Again, before I jump into this, I want to remind you of 2 things. Thinking of how these strategies can be used for your own daily practice in your role in a school or a district, and two, how you can maybe use these strategies to support, inspire, engage, and motivate your colleagues and or leadership to make change. And the second thing I want to remind you of is at the very beginning of this afternoon's webinar, I talked about the act with intentionality. We talked about the ladder of risk. We talked about the house model of awareness to foundation, or excuse me, awareness to empathy. We talked about we need to build awareness, we need to shift mindsets, and then we get to actionable change. And so as I go through these strategies, keep in mind those high-level themes and the roles that they play within these strategies. So number one, if we want to change mindsets, if we want to make this mindset into action happen, we've got to come up with comprehensive plans where we engage all of the community stakeholders. And in many schools, there may be community stakeholders that I haven't included up here. I was trying to think of the most common in a school. You have educators. And when I say educators, I'm talking educators from the broadest sense. So we've got gen ed teachers, we've got special educators, we've got interventionists, we've got unified arts teachers, we've got professional staff, right? So really thinking about anyone in the school that's working with kids. We obviously have students, all students with and without a diagnosed disability. And we have families, parents, caregivers, guardians. So as we go through these strategies, let's really be mindful and thinking about how can we apply various strategies to each of these stakeholders to really ensure that systemic tangible change does happen. So the first place to start, I like to call check the pulse. We need to assess what are your community's current perceptions of disability, right? Because we can't really go any further until we know where we're starting. And some, even within your community, maybe your parents are at one level, students are at another level, and even within educators, you might have some educators at one level and others at a different level. So how can we assess current perceptions of disability within your learning community? You can give surveys. And in the Padlet, I have included some very specific studies and reports of survey questions that have been designed to specifically assess and evaluate someone's perception of people with disabilities. So you don't need to create surveys. A lot of that is out there and done, and you can use those and use that information. So doing surveys, whether that's through SurveyMonkey, Google Forms, there's so many ways you can send out surveys these days. And thinking about, maybe there's a survey you create for educators, for students, and for parents. I'm working with a school district right now, and I'm helping them design a student survey for grades 5 and 6 to get student feedback on how inclusive they perceive their school to be. You could hold focus groups where you bring in people and just have a conversation, essentially taking the survey questions, but making them open-ended conversations. Anecdotal conversations that you have with kids, with parents, with colleagues, keep track of that. Keep a log, keep a Google spreadsheet where you're keeping track of things. And being really observant, observing what's happening in your learning community in terms of the language people are using. We can learn a lot about someone's perception of people with disabilities by paying attention to the language, both oral and written, that someone uses, as well as someone's behavior. Consider areas of community consistency. So by that, I mean, as we check the pulse, we're thinking about, are all the students in the same place? Are all the teachers in the same place? Are things consistent between our stakeholder groups, or are they inconsistent? Because the way that you're going to have the biggest bang for your buck in terms of making change is addressing those areas of inconsistency within your community stakeholders. So again, it's considering the areas of consistency and simultaneously those areas of inconsistency, and that targeting those areas of inconsistency are most likely going to be the most impactful places to start. And lastly, and I put in big letters, be aware of your own bias, be aware of your own preconceived notions, stereotypes about individuals with disabilities, because your own bias or the lens that you put on as you're creating a survey or having a conversation or making an observation may influence the way you perceive it to be. So really try to, as Brene Brown says, stay out of judgment. Really try to take that 30,000-foot bird's eye view. So a few things to consider when we check the pulse to assess, evaluate, figure out where is our community right now in their perceptions of disability. Again, feel free to write questions in the Q&A box as well as in the chat, and that there are a lot of resources on the Padlet that link to each of these pages. So once we've checked the pulse, we know where our community stakeholders are, we can then think about what resources do we want to share to address those areas of inconsistency, right? Because resources help us build that awareness of understanding. Resources help us build that common language, that foundational awareness about what we're talking about. So some things to consider when we build resources. You could create an online library of resources for your colleagues or parents or families. That could be made up of articles, research studies, tips and tricks from various resources. There's so much out there. And one of the things that I found is that sending links to people here and there doesn't work. People get very overwhelmed. But the best way to do it is kind of like the way we've designed the Padlet. There needs to be one place, whether that's a Google folder or a Padlet or a web page. There needs to be one point of entry that all these resources are being put up on, and then you need to figure out the best way to share them with others. Another strategy that can really help for educators and students is to curate a section in your school library focused on books that have characters with disabilities, what I would call disability awareness books. And actually Changing Perspectives, my nonprofit, we've curated a very extensive list of books divided out by disability category. I mean, if you want to email me, I'd be happy to help get that information to you. But again, make it really easy. Have your librarian pull those books and put them on a shelf. And those are books that teachers can read to students, that students can read on their own, that students can check out and bring home. So again, a simple little thing like pulling 10, 20, 30 books that have characters with disabilities, putting them on a shelf could have really exponential impact on all of those stakeholders. And then it's really providing the opportunity to engage in these conversations about characters. So actually on the bottom of the screen, I put a couple books here that I like. Wonder is very popular picture book about a young man who's born with a craniofacial anomaly and hearing loss, the same condition that I was born with. How Katie Got a Voice is a great picture book about a little girl named Katie who gets an AAC device and how she's able to communicate in that way. Fish in a Tree, great chapter book about a student with dyslexia. The Pirate of Kindergarten, picture book about a student with a visual impairment. The Alphabet War, picture book about a student with dyslexia. And those are just a few. There's so many out there. In addition to curating a list of books or a physical area in your school library with books, I also suggest creating an online library of videos, like that video that I shared with you this afternoon of Cole talking about his friend Steven. And I'm so glad that that one participant wrote in the chat about their 9-year-old son who watched it, right? So what I would suggest is create a Google spreadsheet where you could drop links to videos in and share that with all your colleagues. Again, it's one place we're putting all these resources, but these short, 2-minute videos could be extremely powerful. I'm also thinking about the video I showed in last week's session with you, where the world was designed for people with disabilities and people without were the minority. All those videos could be extremely powerful in helping to build that awareness and understanding. And lastly, work with administration to develop a plan for easy, low-risk sharing of information, right? We need this to be easy. We don't want to overwhelm people, and we need it to be low risk, right? Some of these books, the videos, very low risk. We're dipping our toe in the water. We're starting to engage. We're building some common language. We're building some awareness and understanding about these concepts. So we've checked the pulse. We know where we need to focus our energy. Then we're going to curate resources around where we need to focus our energy and our education and build that awareness and mindset. Next comes kind of the next level, a little bit higher risk, right? We're going to educate, we're going to engage, and we're going to inspire. When I think about education, I think about delivering information. When I think about engaging, I think about discussing, reflecting, talking about that education that was just delivered. And when I think about inspiring, that's people going out and making change and doing the action. So how can we educate, engage, and inspire? Well, you could implement some disability awareness programming in your school. You could invite a guest speaker to come in to share their story. I do a lot of guest speaking about my disability, and that's the picture here on the screen. But what I would recommend is that there are most organizations that do work for adaptive sports programs will come to schools and share. Community organizations that advocate for people with disabilities are always looking to come to schools and share. Programs that train seeing eye dogs, guide dogs, service dogs, they will always come to schools to share. So there's huge opportunities probably right in your own community to invite guest speakers into your school to share their story. The other thing is to think about implementing disability awareness curriculum. Disability awareness curriculum could be really impactful for students in helping them better understand disabilities to start to shift their mindset. And it also could be really powerful for especially gen ed teachers, right? Like I know as a gen ed teacher, when I went through teacher training, there really wasn't, I didn't have to learn a lot about specific disabilities. It was like, the 504 process, the road to an IEP, things of that nature. And so by asking your teachers to teach students more explicitly about disabilities, we're not only helping students, but we're actually helping teachers better learn about disabilities that might be prevalent in their classroom as well. At Changing Perspectives, we have pre-K through high school disability awareness curriculum, but I also know about other disability awareness curriculums too. So if you're trying to find a good fit for your school or district, again, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to help you. Provide opportunities for school staff to discuss issues of disability at staff meetings and in-service trainings. Thinking about that ladder of risk, build out, a plan of discussion. Even if it's starting your staff meeting or an in-service with a short video and having your colleagues just do a quick turn and talk about it. But build in opportunities that this is not just a one and done on one PD day in August at the beginning of the school year where you talk about disabilities, but that this is a consistent theme that you're talking about all year round, even if it's in little bite-sized chunks. Thinking about the parent community and family engagement. Think about ways to host parent and caregiver informational meetings. Panel discussions could be really, really powerful. Bring in, ask a panel, and maybe there's a special educator, an administrator, an OT, an SLP, different people in your school who work closely with students with disabilities. Host a little panel discussion so parents can just better understand who are these individuals. What roles do they play? Think about hosting a parent program to support parents in discussing disabilities at home. I have so many parents that come to me and go, I don't even know how to talk to my kids about disabilities. And again, a plug for Series 3, where we will be doing parent sessions. And also parent discussions. We're helping parents understand what disabilities are. I did a really great parent program outside of LA maybe more than a couple of years ago, maybe 4 years ago at a school. And we did a parent program where we actually asked some parents of students with disabilities to present on their experience as a parent with a disability to all the other parents who attended. It was incredibly powerful. So there's lots, and that's definitely a higher risk sort of parent engagement opportunity, but there's lots of different ways that you can educate, engage, and inspire through parent and family engagement workshops. All right, so I shared a little bit about the different community stakeholders. I talked about how you can check the pulse. I discussed ways of sharing resources and also suggestions for how you can educate, engage, and inspire. What we're going to do is, I promise, it's the last Google form of the afternoon here, but we're going to put a link to a Google form in the chat where I'm going to ask you to answer these questions for yourself. And I really hope that actually in answering these questions gives you kind of like an action plan for yourself and what you could do. So since I really want to make sure people take time and think deeply about this, let's give folks again the 2.5 minutes. We'll put some music on and really think about all the things that I just went over around how we can assess where our stakeholders are, the different ways of sharing resources, and also ways to educate, engage, and inspire all those stakeholders in this work. All right, thanks everybody for taking that time. I hope that was helpful in really starting to give you a roadmap on how you might start. And again, this might be something that you're thinking about for next school year and really starting to think about, okay, if the first step is checking the pulse, how can I start now in terms of building out those surveys or those check the pulse instruments, if you will? How can I work with my leadership team in my school to think about the best way that we can roll that out next year? And really, the school year is quick. So if you want to be able to check the pulse, share resources, educate, engage, and inspire within a school year, we have to really think about how we move things along. Or maybe it's something where you're thinking, okay, in my school system or my school, this is maybe a 3-year process or a 2-year process. But again, thinking about it in these very intentional steps. Another quote I want to share: nothing about us without us. Again, just a few words, but extremely powerful. Nothing about us without us. So we are coming to the point of the afternoon where we're going to be opening it up to questions. And I know there have been questions that have been dropped in the Q&A and the chat. throughout this presentation, and I want to make sure we have an opportunity to address them. But before I stop the screen share and open it up to questions, I want to make sure that everyone is aware that the next two webinars will be on January 25th and on February 1st. And on January 25th, what we're going to do is really talk about what is inclusion, because we haven't really talked about what is inclusion yet. We've just been talking about what is disability, right? And what are our mindsets of disability? How do we shift mindsets and perception? So on January 25th, we're going to get grounded in what is inclusion. And then on February 1st, I'm going to go through some specific strategies for implementing more authentically inclusive practices within your school community. And then later on in February, there will be those parent workshops as well. So make sure that you share these with your friends, with your colleagues, with your neighbors, with your family, if you find this valuable. A recording of this workshop will be sent out to you, as Janelle said at the beginning, within 24 hours. Also, since this is the end of the first two-part series, there is a survey that we're asking folks to complete, and that is also going into the chat. So you got a lot of things in the chat. You got registration links, you've got surveys, you've got lots of fun stuff. But as you make sure you're registered for the next set of workshops, as you start filling out the survey, we are going to now, I'm going to stop the slideshow. Again, you have access to this deck in the Padlet. And I'm going to ask my wonderful back-end team what questions were in the chat and the Q&A that we can address and answer for folks this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Sam. And I want everyone to know I just dropped the registration link in the chat for the next two sessions because they are separate registrations. So if you have not already registered to come see Sam in the next two sessions, please click on that link that I just dropped in the chat box. Also, there's a question, there's some just logistic questions coming in, Sam, so I want to address that.
Yeah, let's do those first.
Yeah, so the parent sessions that are coming up, I'm going to drop that link also again in the chat box, but those are February 3rd and February 8th. And I wanted to make sure everyone also knew that we will have a translator available for those two sessions, same time, 3:30 to 5:30. So here is that link that I just put in the chat. Please share that widely with your family, communities, and other school districts around you, county offices. Anyone and everyone is welcome to attend at no charge to families, parents, and caregivers. So please share widely. And then Dawn is going, actually, Dawn, I don't know if you have it, but I have it right here to drop the survey link to for everyone to complete for the last two sessions. I'm dropping that survey link in the chat right now. And we would love it if you could complete that. And then Sam, a few questions for you.
All right.
All right. So, oh, sorry, one more logistics question about certificate of completion. The certificate of completion is located on the Padlet and it is not individualized by name. So you can go ahead and add your name to it. All right, you ready, Sam?
I'm ready.
Questions, actually, not too much. The first question came up much earlier in the session, but it was, how can we change educators and staff mindsets even after sharing awareness, providing resources about inclusion, and sharing these webinars? There is still they are still set in their old ways and won't recommend inclusion for those families that advocate for inclusion. They still want children in special day classes regardless.
Wow, that's a big question. It sounds like you are fighting an uphill battle over there. I think one piece that we often forget is this idea of kind of universal design for learning, which we're going to get in, we're going to get into in the next two sessions when we talk more about inclusive practice. But I think there's a misconception that if we were to be more inclusive, for some reason, that is a negative or a detriment to both students with and without disabilities. And so I think we have to really help folks understand that actually including students with disabilities is best for everybody. And it actually improves, academic success, it improves social success, but it's the idea of UDL that we're changing something because of a subset of students, but actually by changing that one thing, we're going to improve and level the playing field for all students. And so I think, you might want to look into not just trainings like these, but almost like UDL trainings as well, because I think UDL trainings can help folks think about that, because I also think there are folks that if they hear the word inclusion, they hear, supporting students with disabilities, there's immediately a wall that goes up. There's a sense of defensiveness. There's a sense of fear and ambivalence. And so if you kind of enter it from maybe the UDL lens, like, hey, let's do some trainings to support all students, and then from that build into this piece is one way to think about it. I know that isn't the magic button. And I saw Don just said, just keep trying. You've got to pick away at it. It could take, and maybe in your school system, it isn't that you check the pulse, you share resources, you educate, engage, and inspire in a year. Maybe it's you check the pulse for a year. That's all you can do. You report out on what you found to your whole team. Then maybe the next year it's about sharing resources. Then maybe it's the next year about, even educate, engage, and inspire could be broken up. Those are different things. And so as much as we wish we could snap our fingers and it could all change tomorrow, it really is something that maybe you need to think about as a multi-year rollout.
I appreciate that, Sam. And really, like you're talking about finding that entry point and addressing it from a variety of perspectives, and know that it's going to take time. This work and system change does not happen overnight. It really does take some time. Another question that's coming up: what if educators and staff are just not open to attend these trainings and webinars, even though you keep sharing them, but they don't attend?
I think it's people are only going to attend something that they feel has relevance to their work. And so again, I think it's the way in which we frame this work to ensure that people see relevance, right? Like I remember even when I was a classroom teacher, the mentality, I think some people chatted about this last time in the chat, but like the mentality, like it's the special educator's problem, like just deal with that kid, right? So if an educator doesn't see the relevance of this work, doesn't see how it's going to improve their practice in any way, it's going to make their life easier in any way, they're not going to attend. So it's really about kind of finding that in and figuring out, okay, what piece of this is relevant to X, Y, and Z educator, and how can I lead with that?
Sam, I think we caught all of the questions. I've been trying to review the Q&A and the chat box to make sure I didn't miss anything, but I think we caught everything. Dawn, let me know if I missed something.
So one quick one, because I'm just not typing fast enough, I can talk faster than I can type, is that when you sign up for the January 25th session, it will automatically sign you up for the second part of that series. You don't have to do them separately. And someone asked about personalizing the certificates. They're not editable because they're PDFs. They were done in Canva to make them look nice. So they look fabulous, but they're not personalizable. If your district or supervisor wants something more specific, you might attach your registration confirmation to the certificate, and that should suffice in most places. If anyone needs more than that, please contact me individually.
Thank you, Dawn, for that added piece of information. And the certificates are underneath each session. So you'll see 2 certificates on the Padlet. I think that's it, Sam. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank everybody for being here again. I know it's a lot of information. I warned you in the first session. I'm kind of throwing information at you. I hope you were able to, like in the first session, let it marinate think about, how it's going to work for you. I recognize that we're all coming from this work from a different vantage point, and that we're really all just trying to, I always talk about, like, we're just shifting 10% every time. We're shifting our perspective. We're thinking about new resources. We're thinking about ways we can do this work with greater intentionality to really achieve the goals that we're trying to achieve. So I hope to see many, many, many of you on January 25th, which, wow, I guess that's like just a few days away, where we'll jump into inclusion. Thank you to Janelle and Don and the backend team for all your support for each of these webinars. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your Wednesday afternoon.
And thank you, Sam, for your inspiration, for your practical strategies and application. We appreciate you. Have a good day, everyone.